So I would like to just start by that icebreaker question that we started with earlier today. How many of y'all know where your ancestors came from? Can I get a show of hands? Do you know what country your ancestors came from? All right, who felt confident in that? You felt confident in that.
Lots of different countries. Europe.
Europe. Anybody else? Tim, where did your ancestors come from?
I think like Scotland and Ireland, somewhere there.
Cool.
Between.
So I got really into this for a little while. My ancestors came from a handful of different places, but I was amazed about how much you could find if you go and do a quick search on Ancestry.com. There's free 14-day trial. I highly recommend it. On my dad's side, we were able to get it back to 1635 when my ancestors, Thomas Dakin, came over on a ship called the Abigail. We know that the Abigail took 97 days to get across the Atlantic Ocean from England. And that's kind of crazy, 97 days on a ship. We know there was livestock. We know that there was smallpox, unfortunately, for those that they brought it to in America. And there's a lot of information that we know from this trip. So 1635, 220 passengers came to Concord, Massachusetts. And it was my good fortune that they started procreating. On the other side of my family, one of my great-great-grandfathers, Johannes Reisinger, was part of, his family was part of the failed German Revolution of 1848. So they were fighting for some of the same things that we were fighting for today, like voting rights and equal pay, and seriously, some of the exact same things that we still are fighting for crazily. So he came to America, and it was 1848. He came a couple years later. He was 13 years old, and his 16-year-old sister came with him. We don't know much beyond that, except that the parents probably couldn't afford to come themselves, so they put their kids on this long, long boat ride, and they came to America. And my ancestor, Johannes, quickly took the name John, and he started making German pastries, probably not dissimilar from Owl Bakery. And he was really successful. This is Johannes. He's got those good mutton chops that a good Reisinger would. But John quickly came to America and embraced it. And he was part of this all German-speaking troop that fought for the Union. Imagine that, an all-immigrant troop that spoke mostly German, and the President of the United States, who was about to take office, Abraham Lincoln, asked them if they would guard him at his inauguration. And I don't know, so you can see the top hats of President Lincoln's inauguration. There's only a couple pictures of it, but my ancestor was there, and I took a lot of pride in that. So there are many genealogical lines that have already been traced, and I encourage you to find yours. But it's not the case for everyone. The reason I was able to find my ancestors is because the color of my skin is white. The theme of the day is transparency, and I'm going to tell you about our Buncombe County slave deed project. In 2012, my friend Deborah Miles from the Center for Diversity Education came to me to ask if we would be willing to display our slave records for this upcoming exhibit that was going to be at the Library of UNC Asheville. They're going to be honoring the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I told Deborah, you know, I always appreciate what y'all are trying to work on, and I would love to support you, but in the Register of Deeds office, we've always been historically charged with keeping birth records and death records and marriage records and property records. And Deborah looked at me and she's like, Drew, you have property records. And since slaves were considered property, their transactions are listed in your office. And it was that moment where I knew it was my responsibility to bring these documents to light. So when a slave was sold in Buncombe County, there was this bill of sale. It looked something like this. And when a slave was sold, there's a bill of sale, and the record of that sale would have been recorded in my office like all other property records. Over the past 10 years, the Register of Deeds office has made huge gains in digitizing records and making things more publicly available. I realized that we could use the same technology that we've been using to put all these records online, and we could do the same for these slave records. So for the first time in the United States, a county, Buncombe County, put their records of slavery online, all to be in one place so people could easily find them. Yeah. So part of the goal of this project is to remember the names of those who've been forgotten by time, but to help make it easier for African Americans to trace their genealogical lines. A few months ago, I got a phone call. The woman on the other line was calling from Washington, D.C. Her name was Shada Vance. Shada was calling because she found one of her ancestors, Hutzel Vance, in our records online. She asked me a question: can you tell me if my ancestor was enslaved? And so while we've been doing this for a while, no one has called and asked that direct question of, was my ancestor enslaved? And you could tell it was something she was struggling with because she wanted to know for herself, and she just put it right out there. So unbelievably powerful moment that struck me that I wasn't quite sure how to deal with. So I said, let's go through the records and let's look. Here is the record that she found. This is a cohabitation record. In the state of North Carolina, slaves could not legally marry in the state because they weren't really recognized as fully being people. After the Civil War ended, we had to treat African Americans like people, so we forced them to come to the county courthouse and record how long they'd been married, or more of a backhanded way of saying it, how long have you been cohabitating? So these are cohabitation records, and they're an amazing set of records of those who survived slavery. But here we see that Hutzel Vance was married for the last 17 years to a woman named Myra Mills. So this is where I joined her search in trying to find her ancestors. We next found, so what I did is if anyone was searching genealogical records in Buncombe County that may or may not be online, I plugged Hutzel Vance's name into our system that searches all the births, deaths, marriages, and property records. And I found that he got married again later on in life. He was 75 years old. He was marrying this young 40-year-old woman. But the cool part about this is that we know that his parents were listed on this. So we now have been able to take it back for Shada to another line of her ancestors. She now knows that her ancestors are Richard Vance and Aggie Vance, which I thought I was really happy for. I was glad to be able to tell her who her ancestors' ancestors were. But the name Aggie Vance stuck with me. Where do I know that name? Who is Aggie Vance? And then, yeah, the same aha moment of, oh, there's that monument downtown. So there's this old book on my desk. I didn't even go online. I went to like the original book to make it have all the feelings. So this is Priscilla Vance's will. My will and desire is that my Negro boy Hudson and my Negro girl Ann be and remain with their mother Aggie. All three named Negroes be disposed of as my son David Vance thinks most proper during the life of said Aggie, and after her death, that the said Negro boy Hudson and the said Negro girl Ann be exposed to sale, and the proceeds of such sale be divided amongst my 4 daughters. So we have now learned that not only was Shada, so this is Priscilla Vance, she's the grandmother of Zebulon Baird Vance, North Carolina's Civil War governor, who we now have a monument to in the heart of downtown Asheville. It defines our downtown square. And we realized that this was going to open up a whole new world of records because her ancestor, Hutzel Vance, was enslaved by the governor's family. We decided we would go over to the Vance birthplace. The Vance birthplace has historians and docents who've been researching genealogical lines for a while, and we were like, maybe they can help us. But it's this challenging moment of like, you're excited to learn more. At the same time, why is there still this monument honoring Vance, and why is there still a Confederate flag flying over the Vance birthplace where my ancestors toiled? All right, so they did have information. They had this amazing old letter, and they had a world of information about who the slaves were who were enslaved on the property. But there's this one really cool letter that Shada was excited about, and it's the reason I'm going to share it with you today. When the governor was born, he was born Zebulon Vance to this prominent family, and they wrote a letter to their kin in East Tennessee saying that we have a new son, his name is Zeb, he's going to do great things. At the bottom of the letter, the slave Agnes wrote a note to her ancestors who were enslaved in another state. It says, "Old Agnes sends her love to Jane and Wilson and Anne and the black people." Just a really sweet, kind note that Shada was like, there's a personal moment that my ancestor is talking to her other kin who've been separated because of this horrible thing called slavery. But we still have family, and we now know more about who they were and where they were and what they were talking about. So Shada found a lot of joy in that, and therefore I did too. And most people who are searching old records, they're not going to find notes between slaves. Like, this is a rare, rare thing that she now has access to. So one thing that was hard for Shada was that she didn't have to go that far to figure out more who the Vances were. She lives in Washington, D.C., but because Governor Vance is one of North Carolina's 2 favorite sons, who we have put in Washington, D.C.'s statuary hall. We have Governor Vance in her hometown of Washington, D.C. So she didn't have to go very far, but she ended up deciding to come to Asheville to research her roots further and see where her ancestors toiled. Shada and her father, Anthony, came to Asheville a little while ago. They came to the Vance birthplace, and they saw where her ancestors toiled. They got to feel the ground, and they see the earth, and they were like, this is it. This was where my ancestors lived. And it's a state historic site that y'all should all go visit. So there's one story that I was trying to pull out what I could find from their line. Like, what do y'all know about your ancestors? Is there any stories? Is there anything that you remember? And one hard story that was the only thing that they knew about Hutzel was, they told me, there's this old family lore, this oral tradition that they wanted to figure out if it was true or not. So the story goes that Hutzel was a very large man, almost of mythical proportions, close to 7 feet tall. At least that's the way the story went. They were also told that his large stature and dark skin must have made someone around him feel threatened. And Hutzel had fathered children with a white woman. So the story goes that in 1909, someone found him to be so intimidating that they burned down his home on Christmas Eve with him in it. And they didn't know if it was true, but they were curious, like, is there truth to this? And because we live in this amazing age of digitization, we were able to find this amazing record from the Asheville Citizen-Times. It says, the body of Hudson Vance, the old Negro who was burned to death in his cabin near the Weaver Dam, will be buried today in a burial plot at the Alexander Chapel. While it was inspiring to go on this scavenger hunt with Shada and to be able to find not only evidence of the stories that she had been told by her grandfather, but to help her take back her lineage further than she actually knew. And one thing that I'd like to point out is the last name Vance. Let's think about that one piece for a minute. Shada's last name is still Vance. We aren't sure when Shada's descendants were brought to America. We don't know what her true family name was prior to slavery. We know that when slavery ended, Hutzel chose the last name Vance after he gained his freedom. But think about that. Think about your own last name or your heritage or your nationality and where it's derived from and what it means to you. When I think of Reisinger, I am proud that my ancestors fought in this failed German Revolution. And then they came to America to fight for us to have the freedoms that we now have today. These are all things that I'm really proud of when I think of the last name Reisinger. When Shada sees her name, it's forever connected to the fact that her ancestors were enslaved by the Vance family. Shada's story is incredible, and that's why I wanted to share it with you today. But it's also unique. For many people, Buncombe County's records are not enough for them to trace their family history. Because this Buncombe County slave deed database is only within Buncombe County, slaves were often traded across county and state lines frequently. So it's only so good, it's only so helpful. What we truly need is a national database of slave records. Deborah Miles and I were talking about, like, so how do we start to achieve this? How do we achieve this big thing that we're looking for? And right now in the state of North Carolina, we are working with our North Carolina State Archivist, Sarah Kuntz. And Sarah and I and Deborah have partnered with UNC Greensboro. UNC Greensboro has started something a little while ago called the Digital Library of American Slavery. There's some great features there that they already have, some slave petitions, but they're like, yeah, of course we'd love to have a database of the names of those who were enslaved. And it's a much bigger, they didn't realize what they were getting into, and they said, yeah, we'll take this on with you. Currently North Carolina is on track to create the first database of slave records and a registry of names of those who were enslaved in the state of North Carolina. It's going to take a lot of work out east in some of the more impoverished counties where there are big cotton plantations and a lot more slaves. Those registers of deeds offices are still just trying to get by. They barely have enough money to keep the day-to-day functions up. So we're gonna need a lot of grant funding, but there's already 8 to 10 counties who've taken on this project with Buncombe County and UNCG, and those records can be found online now for the first time. So as easily as I've researched my ancestry, what I didn't tell you at first was another piece of my story. Some of my ancestors fought for the Confederacy, and at least one of my ancestors from North Carolina owned slaves as well. Part of understanding the project is also understanding the transparency piece and learning more about where we come from and the privilege that was gained from my ancestors owning slaves and becoming wealthier because of that and what has been passed down to me. While this may make us uncomfortable, we cannot pick and choose which parts of our ancestry happened, and for the exact same reason, our government should not pick and choose which documents are made available about our past. Up until recently, there's been a blatant lack of transparency by keeping these documents on dusty courthouse shelves for generations. We're continuing to deny African Americans access to their own personal stories. And let's be clear, do I think that a national slave deed database is going to be the great equalizer for America? Absolutely not. Will it heal the racial divisions that we have in our country? No. But we have a lot of work to do, and I think we have to start by going back to where we came from and understanding how we got to where we are today. I also think that our country could be a kinder place if we all researched who our ancestors actually are. When I hear y'all talk about where y'all's ancestors are from, I'm really impressed. Y'all are above average. But maybe society would soften its edges if we could all remember that we are a nation of immigrants. And it seems like right now in America, we need that today. As you leave here today, let's please hold our elected officials accountable for greater transparency at all levels. And let's start by demanding that every county makes their records of slavery more available to everyone. Thank you guys for having me.